Hi, everyone. This is Katie Lund. We're just going to wait a couple minutes to start here. So thank you for everyone who's on the line, and appreciate your patience for just a minute. Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's Resilient Connecticut webinar hosted by CIRCA. We're the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. Today's webinar is focusing on new planning and visualization tools for sea level rise. I'm the Director of Engagement here at CIRCA. I'll be moderating this hour-long webinar, which is part of a series that we're hosting along with partners on a variety of adaptation and resilience topics relevant to our state. Today's presenters we're lucky to have here in our office here at CIRCA. We have Joe McDougall. He is UConn's professor in residence and the executive director of the UConn School of Law's Center for Energy and Environmental Law, or many of you may know, is called CEEL at the UConn School of Law. We also have Alex Selson, CIRCA's deputy executive director and the director of resilience design. Today they're both going to be speaking about their work related to a municipal resilience planning assistance project that was generously funded by the Connecticut Department of Housing, and some of the exciting new planning and visualization tools that we are going to be releasing for sea level rise. So before they start, just a few webinar mechanics to mention. We are recording the webinar and we'll post it online on our website. And you all have your audio muted, except for the presenters, but you can use the chat box, which should be located in the lower right in the middle of your screen. You can use that to ask questions throughout the hour. If your chat box isn't open, that's where you can find it on your screen. And you just simply have to type in your question and then press enter, and then we'll be able to see your question here. So we'll try to save about 10 minutes at the end of the webinar, and I'll do my best to track your questions and to facilitate responses with our speakers here. So I'll start by turning it over to Joe McDougall to begin.
Hi, everyone. As Katie said, I'm Joe McDougall. I'm a professor in residence at the UConn Law School, and I get to help head up our Center for Energy and Environmental Law. There we go. So today I want to do a couple of things. My part of the presentation is going to be relatively brief, about 10 or so minutes, because we really want to get to some of the tools that we're talking about as to how to help implement what's going on. So I want to talk a little bit about the scientific basis for policy discussions. However, I'm an attorney, so realize when attorneys give scientific basis, it's because somebody else told me. Largely, I'll be doing the work for Jim O'Donnell, who maybe some of you have seen or seen his presentations. I do want to talk about the planning and policy implications of that work. I'm then going to move to Public Act 1882. That's the Sea Level Rise Act that was passed in 2018. I'm only going to give some highlights of the law, ones that are probably most relevant to what we're talking about here. And then I'm going to end with a quick description of some of the CIRCA resources we have, white papers, some tools, but also really then to turn it over to Alex as we discuss some of the ways that the planning implications of what we've been doing, what we get to. So let's start with the scientific basis for policy decisions. First thing, a little bit about CIRCA. So it is the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. It's a unique structure. It's focused very much on state level resilience. Really, that's a terrific place to be if you're not enmeshed in these issues. Almost all the action on resilience has been coming from at the state action, from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative to renewable portfolio standards to state and local environmental laws. States are also very receptive to trying to leverage expertise. I was recently with a very well-regarded environmental academic. I was there presenting CIRCA with Professor O'Donnell, and the two of us asked him, said, are you aware of anything like CIRCA? And the answer is really no. CIRCA has a partnership with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. We sit together on the same board. And it means that we have the ability to take some of the science and policy development and see if we can get it placed in the hands of those who are regulating and help set the laws. So let me give a quick sea level rise story, and it sort of talks a bit about, I think, how the policy in this area unfolds. Once upon a time, I had the aforementioned Professor O'Donnell, Jim, come to lecture to my class. I was teaching climate law, and this was right about the time where in this grant, his research had started to coalesce. And I asked him to present some of the research in a way that would really be, accessible to law students. And he said a couple of things that he told us we should be excited about, and then he said some things that he didn't think were that exciting, but on a policy basis we were really engaged with. So we start with this. This is a sort of well-known chart. It's NOAA's version of sea level rise change scenarios: high, intermediate, low. There's a lot of policy decisions that go through. These are the global sea level rise estimates. And part of the charge that the legislature had given the University of Connecticut was to try and develop standards and studies to determine what this means for us, for Long Island Sound, for riverine flooding. What are the numbers we should use? So out of this research came Connecticut's regional effect, or sort of Connecticutizing those big charts. And one of the key insights is, for those of you who can see this, is that when Jim and the others were looking at it, they said, in 2100, the numbers vary dramatically. So these curves, as you can tell, have moved. A lot of it has to do with the mechanics of Long Island Sound and our local sea level rise. And you look out to 2100, there's a big disparity. But if you look at 2050, and this was the key insight, the numbers don't vary that much. And one of the key decisions was to say, if you're going to be developing, if you're going to be working with a planning and zoning commission, if you're a municipality or a state planning a project, what should be your sea level rise assumption? And about 50 centimeters by 2050 is the bound that comes out from this observation. A second thing is that maybe some of you have seen in the early days of discussing sea level rise, something called the bathtub model. You sit, and I know I sat in many of these presentations. I was in Madison. I was an elected official. I was a zoner and on the board of selectmen. And groups would come in and they'd say, how do you plan for sea level rise? Say, sea level rise is going up 2 feet. And then suddenly there would be an animation. Blue would come over. It would rise uniformly on 2 feet, and suddenly Fairfield is drowned. That's called bathtub modeling. It's an estimating tool. But until you actually look at the sea level rise as it relates to the actual geometry of the coastline, you come to different policy decisions. So the graphic on the right with the orange curve is right from the CIRCA presentations. What they told us when they started that first basis as to what can rise, that the number of homes that are going to be impacted, there are many in terms of just pure inundation. The sea level rise will get it high enough to affect them. But it's an orange rind. It's not as big as the homes that will be impacted by flooding and storms. Another key observation was this. This is the one that scientists don't find exciting, but policy people do. One of the consequences of looking at Connecticut's effect is to start looking at the frequency of flooding at both the 10 and 100-year level, really the storm surge flooding. And what you see, one big takeaway, is that throughout Connecticut, there's a significant change. But another thing which I'd never heard before, which makes a big difference to us, is that the eastern sound, think New Haven toward Mystic, is going to have a very different reality from the area from New Haven to Stamford. The storm surge numbers change. Now, my limited understanding tells me that this has to do with the fact that it's wavier down by Greenwich than it is by New London, so the increment of sea level rise has a different percentage impact. One of the exciting policy conclusions about this is there was a gentleman who worked on this project for a long time, Bill Rath, and Bill's team went out and they looked at what are the actual base flood elevations. How are the towns actually treating their base flood elevations at the time of this? Have they been experiencing this already? And what we found was yes. When we look at it, what we see is that the towns going roughly from New Haven onward are already elevating their base flood elevation. So if you can see it, the green dots are BFE plus 1, the blue dots are BFE plus 2. In other words, there's a FEMA-based base flood elevation, and the towns have said, that's not good enough. We're experiencing real flooding, real problems above that level. And without knowing any of this or knowing that it's connected, they unilaterally have been increasing the height in which they have to build their buildings because they're already experiencing this disparate impact. This brings us then to some of the planning and policy implications of this information. One is that the policy should be storm and flood focused. There's a very reasonable debate that I think went on earlier. We talked about inundation focus, but I think what this work tells us is that we need to worry about storms and floods. Two, some of the work done as part of this grant from UConn Clear that surveyed groups, and also as part of my part of the project, where the team working on this spoke to over 600 people in different groups, is that municipalities, architects, everyone, what they wanted was a planning number. They didn't want a chart. They didn't want a way to figure it out. Tell us what number we should plan to. They need that concrete impact. And the third thing is this disparate impact, that sea level rise is going to mean something different depending on where you are in the Connecticut coast. I want to talk for a second, because this is going to be important to the framing for Alex's presentation about storm and flood focused. One of the key preparedness planning needs to be for storms, big storms like hurricanes, but perhaps even more importantly, nuisance storms of much heavier rainfall. Depending on where you are in Connecticut, you've been experiencing that for the last 2 days. But the real question is, what does it mean when the 25-year storm comes every 5 years, or the 5 or 10-year storm comes every year? It now gives us rainfall outside of the policy, the zoning, the ways that we've been adapting all these years. And in some respects, that's what has the bigger impact. People are experiencing this. CIRCA recently did a presentation of one of the coastal communities, and this is the part that rang truest to those who were in and around the area. These new normal storms will be worse and more frequent, and really that's the issue that I think is going to start attracting people. This work got codified in part under Public Act 1882. And I just want to give a couple of highlights of the law. One of the things that Connecticut had before this work and before they made a change in the law is that there were conflicting definitions of sea level rise. I mentioned my research assistant, Bill. He came to me one day and said, look at this. There are inconsistent definitions. He had an engineering background. He said, as an engineer, I could maybe use any of these, depending on the context, and it was a bit confusing. One, they had done a historic tide gauge average over, if memory serves, 10 years. For those of you that are scientifically based, you might know that the epoch of tides is actually 19 years. So depending on which 10 years you took, it was under or over reporting. They had a NOAA standard that was in part of the statutes, and they also had a UConn scenario, this work as being reported, but there was no mandate to use it. This was a bit confusing. They signed Public Act 1882, and it did a couple of big things. So the first thing is the 50 centimeters by 2050. That's big news. So Rob Klee, Commissioner Klee, when he spoke for this, he was Commissioner of the DEP, he said, CIRCA's current projection of 50 centimeters of sea level rise in Long Island Sound by the year 2050 is not a prediction, and that's important to know. He said, nor does it represent a mean value or likely outcome. Instead, the scenario establishes a reasonable upper bound for the purposes of adaptation planning, and by enacting SB 7, that's what became this law, state and local agencies will employ it as a prudent and consistent benchmark. So this isn't a prediction. This is the prudent number that you should use in your planning. And then how does this get updated? One thing in the laws, it has to be updated every 10 years. Not, it must be every 10 years, at least every 10 years. So for those of you that spend a lot of time thinking about this area, there are two overarching things. One, nothing ever gets better. So it never seems to be the case where you look at today's prediction and say, oh, well, now that we know it more, it gets better. No, it usually tends to get more alarming. And the second thing is that 10 years is a lot of time. So this idea of it not being static is great, and hopefully it'll be updated even sooner. The procedure for updating is the Marine Sciences Division of UConn will update it, and the DEEP is in charge of both the process and putting it on their website. So there's notification procedures within it. Who has to use this? So first, the municipalities have to use it in their plans of conservation and development. The POCD has to take into account the most recent sea level rise change scenarios updated pursuant to Section B of 25680. That's where this goes through. Beyond the towns, the state has to use it. CGS 16A27. The new plans will take into consideration, there's that same language on the CIRCA scenario. So both the municipalities and the state are using this data as their baseline. Something else that's really important, several places in the statute, we talk about floodproofing within the coastal zone. Floodproofing now includes no less than an additional 2 feet of freeboard above base flood, and any additional freeboard necessary to account for the most recent sea level change scenario, and that's the CIRCA language. Last but not least, the state civil preparedness programs also have to take this into account. So if you think about it, you say, well, those are on planning goals and we're floodproofing. This is a very big change for many of the state departments as well as municipalities and for professionals. So that's a quick summary of why there was a change. There was a new study that told us that there were things that were happening, and they were focused on storms and focused on the different mechanics. We actually got to see that towns were already experiencing it. This had several implications for us, and it got codified through the help of the state government, the agency, and CIRCA into a combined law. So how do we think about this? How do you take this and turn it into something? One piece that I'd like to talk about is that on the CIRCA website are several white papers, depending on who you are or what your interests are. Most of these were generated, again, by the research team that I talked about. Floodplain building elevation standards, talked to a survey of ocean state coastal management programs, the adoption of the sea level rise scenarios and height restrictions. So those are out there, and hopefully we'll be able to expand those over time, even for more. The CIRCA website has a lot of the presentations. It's really available. You can see the technical pieces. If you have more interest in this, or even in the policy pieces, there are longer presentations available throughout. But this last thing that came up for part of the grant that presages the next part is we've generated, as part of this work, a series of planning documents. We recently went to a coastal town for preparation to discuss with them. In that town, we took some of their individual areas and showed them some of the planning concepts. And what we did to try and help and create a tool for towns that Alice will be talking about is create some generalized scenarios that illustrate some of the problems common to Connecticut. This invites a new kind of planning. One thing that people like me talk about a lot is zoning, and what we mean by that is the standard, zoning enabled under CGS 8.2. But what you're going to hear next about is the concept of zones of shared risk, where the idea is we take this information, having identified the problem, take some of the new pieces we've looked at and say, how can we look at the risks in ways that are broader, not just even necessarily directly on flooding, but engage all parts of the town, and what are the areas that have common problems, even if they're outside of traditional municipal and zoning limits. So with that, we're going to take 2 seconds and transition over, and Alex Felsen will be talking to you about this last concept in detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. We're going to transition to a different presentation, and while that's happening here, we do appreciate your insight and the context, I think, that you've given, both from what's been happening here at CIRCA in terms of the research over the past couple of years, and how that has transitioned into a policy realm, and we're going to go from the policy and science into some of these new visualization tools. So we'll turn it over here to Alex, and he can highlight some of these new tools that we have available. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. This is Alex Felsen. I'm Deputy Executive Director at CIRCA and Director of Design for Resilience. And Joe and I have been working together talking through ways of visualizing some of the technical and policy challenges associated with sea level rise and storm surge specific to Connecticut. And today we're excited to present some of these visualizations and hopefully get feedback and some sense of whether or not these are going in the right direction. So just as a context, this is part of the Municipal Resilience Planning Assistance Project, which is on the website. You can see the link at the bottom there if you're interested in understanding more about this. There's multiple components to this grant that was part of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, funded through the Connecticut Department of Housing. This is really one of the last tasks associated with the grant. It's tied in certain ways to Resilient Connecticut, the HUD National Disaster Resilience Grant, in the sense that it feeds into the importance of linking visualization and planning with technical analysis. And I wanted to mention that the Resilient Connecticut proposal included these visualizations, which represent the idea of the resilience corridor that the state presented to the federal HUD. And the idea was really a concept that was generated through discussions with state agencies, with the COGS, with municipalities. And the resilience corridor idea is really an outcome of the value at the local scale of thinking about egress and evacuation routes, and the state's interest in targeted investment strategies so that resiliency funding that went in also produced economic development value. And you can start to see how, in this case, the visualization is a tool to push people forward in understanding and to get everyone on the same page. Joe mentioned the idea of zones of shared risk, and I just wanted to take a moment to explain this further. So in a lot of cases, when you're working with municipalities, you think across neighborhood to neighborhood or municipality scale. One of the realizations when we were dealing with climate adaptation and climate change was that not everyone shares the same risks. And if you zoom in and think about or define subpopulations that share similar issues, you can start to create opportunities for thinking about planning and for funding mechanisms that can support specific targeted subpopulations that share similar risks. So zones of shared risks as a concept that looks at geography, that looks at future flood risk, that looks at infrastructure, existing infrastructure, and housing investment and egress routes, and identifies areas that share similar issues. So you can see this is actually Guilford. This comes out of the Guilford Coastal Resilience Plan. You can see, for example, SH represents Sachem's Head. You can see at the bottom of that there's a red area. Those are repetitive flood loss homes. Those are considered a zone of shared risk unto themselves in the fact that they have share the risk of frequent flooding. But Sachem's Head also has a pinch point at the northern portion that floods maybe once a month or maybe a little bit less, but that area, that pinch point, impacts the entire population within the SH boundary. And recognizing these pinch points and starting to define these zones where risks are shared helps a planning team target specific subpopulations to negotiate adaptation solutions. So building on the idea of zones of shared risk and on the understanding of the complexity of sea level rise and storm surge for municipal managers, we developed these three initial visualization strategies. And you can see on the left, we looked at a barrier beach area with housing and starting to use that as a tool to think about flood risks and sea level rise. We looked in the middle at a peninsula, a land peninsula with an impounded marsh and critical facility to think about the idea of resilience corridors, zones of shared risk, and multifunctional benefits. And on the right, we developed an inland marsh area that has surrounded by housing to look at issues around the protocols behind technical analyses to understand the impact of constrictions or impediments, and wetland capacity for flooding and the impact that these areas have on adjacent housing. So these are some initial diagrams that and we're really looking at the interface between policy, technical analysis, and planning with these diagrams. And the goal is to continue to develop these kinds of graphic analyses and to add to them over time. It's actually, the idea is that it's an iterative process, working with the COGS, the state and municipal managers, and to get feedback to hone the content of this material, and also to add the policy implications and where to look for more information. So you can see on the left is the diagram, the Barrier Beach development planning effort. You can see that we are starting to elaborate on base flood elevation, 100-year storm, plus SLR, and we're looking at different housing typologies. So if you zoom in on the right, you can see that we are targeting even the specific document that Joe had mentioned, the floodplain building elevation standards, recognizing the impact that house raising has in coastal areas as far as the zoning and code limitations on the height of buildings, and the impact on, for example, the views for homes inland. So this may lead to variances on a case-by-case basis, and the idea is, can we start to push these concerns forward and have them the technical analysis and the considerations be more at the forefront of municipal managers moving forward. So, you know, the graphic that we're showing here, the graphics that we're using with the Barrier Beach is also intended to address some of the more complicated considerations around understanding sea level rise and storm surge issues. Joe mentioned the importance of differentiating between hurricanes and chronic storm events and or nuisance storms. And this is a critical consideration, given that it's difficult to invest in adaptation solutions for hurricanes, and that the more nuisance storms or common storms may have a bigger impact over the near term. Although that depends on the hurricane events. And then also understanding the impact of sea level rise over time has been something that's come up as an issue, as well as understanding the combined impact of sea level rise and storm events. So the graph on the left is something that Jim O'Donnell has been using to illustrate or to highlight that we have extensive empirical data on nuisance storm events, and that's part of how we evaluated the expectations of the 2050 storm, and identifying the 50 centimeters that are part of the Public Act 18-82. But you can see that on the right of that graph, there's a lot less data on hurricane events. And so we're dealing with a lower amount of data, but we're also dealing with much larger storm events that have bigger impact. And so understanding the difference across this gradient is a critical consideration, recognizing that there is a continuous distribution, but it's also a good way of showing more rare and extreme events that are much bigger, but may not make sense to defend against, versus the chronic smaller nuisance storms that may cause more nuisance flooding, but may be more something we can address. And on the right, just looking at the example, Joe had mentioned the floodproofing requirements, the 2 feet above BFE, or base flood elevation. On the right really illustrates this idea that we're in a changing condition. So, the 100-year storm event today, by 2050 it's going to be closer to the 500-year storm event today. So if you think about, if you had a house that was directly at the line, the FEMA 100-year storm event, or the 1% storm, if you were to raise that by 2 feet, then by 2050, your building would basically be at the 100-year storm height, given sea level rise. So these kinds of future predictions and the awareness of the implications of sea level rise and how that might impact insurance and flood risk are critical considerations or components of the visualizations. So you can see how by overlaying specific information onto the graphic analysis, we can start talking specifically about flood height impacts and that the water level of a particular storm event will rise over time, and the impact of increased frequency, which Joe also referenced. The idea that a storm that would occur every 10 years in the past, or currently on average, will be more likely every 2 years in the future. So this kind of recognition of both flood height impacts and frequency of storm event are the kind of information we're trying to layer on top of the graphics. The graphic material or the visualizations are also about the geography of Connecticut. So we're interested in identifying typological conditions across the coast and the inland of Connecticut that we can consider from a planning and technical perspective and policy perspective, and can start to influence choices and adaptation solutions. So this first graphic really deals with the barrier beach condition with housing development across it, and you can see some examples. Fairfield on the top, looking at the configuration from 1880 and the development and housing that occurred across this area. You can see East Haven also has a barrier beach development on Cozy Beach, and you can see the development happening there. So these are just some examples of the geographic condition. And I just wanted to highlight also that this idea of visualization and understanding land use history and the historic development patterns is something that also you can find on the CLEAR website. There's examples of this evolution, for example, in Ocean Beach, where housing existed historically impacted from the 1938 hurricane, and there was a conversion of the Ocean Beach area to the Ocean Beach Park. So you can start to recognize through this evaluation of historic trends some of the implications on planning today. And just to take a closer look in terms of how this kind of technical visualization can start to impact or be useful for a particular town. Joe, Jim O'Donnell, and myself, we actually presented in Madison at the bequest of the municipal planner, and we focused in on certain locations that they were interested in understanding better as far as risk concerns. So LiDAR data is readily available on the Connecticut Eco website, and this is very useful for looking at topographic conditions and for understanding the potential for a hydrologic risk, flood risk. Also, just looking at the land use history, we zoomed in on Circle Beach Road, and looking at land use history, you can understand better the impacts of historic storm events and also start to think about how development occurred over time. And so you can start looking at this barrier beach, Circle Beach, for example, and look at the housing across that occurs there. And you can think about the limited elevation change of this area in relation to the wetland complex behind it and Long Island Sound. And then you can start to zoom in and consider the specific housing types, houses that have been raised, houses that have built walls, houses that haven't been raised, that may be at sea level, at the existing sea level, differences across the value of homes, and start to think about the implications of choices being made for a road like Circle Beach, which is a long, isolated, low-lying road connected to Neck Road, which is on higher ground, as you could see earlier from the digital elevation model. So just returning to the idea of zones of shared risk, we would refer to the Circle Beach area as its own zone, since decisions being made on Circle Beach don't have much of an impact on Neck Road. But impacts or decisions on Neck Road do have an impact on Circle Beach. So in a sense, the zone of shared risk for Circle Beach embodies or includes decisions being made in Neck Road, but not vice versa. So you start to see how you can target subpopulations to potentially invest in solutions or to negotiate adaptation strategies. For the town, there's issues associated with decisions being made by homeowners on Circle Beach because the decisions to raise, for example, prolong housing in this area and make demands on the municipality to provide services for homeowners. But there's also potential for septic failure in this area. You're also getting flooding from the front and from behind. So while houses can be raised, raising the road may be costly and requires upkeep and periodic repair, given that flooding will likely occur from both sides. There's also the ecological function and value of this large marsh complex, the East River Marsh Wildlife Area and Grass Island. So one should consider impacts in terms of investment along Circle Beach and its potential impact on this ecological system. And all in all, so just taken together, the idea is that these technical drawings can start to tee up these kinds of considerations for town planners to consider as they develop resiliency investment measures and also as they prioritize solutions. I'm not going to go into great detail for the second and third visualization, but I do want to talk in brief about the ways in which these are influencing or being used as tools to visualize solutions. So in the case of the resilience corridor idea, here really the notion is to recognize the potential opportunity for an evacuation or egress route as an investment strategy for resiliency. This road here could serve as a feeder road to provide access to properties and homeowners while allowing for the Marsh system and Marsh complex to potentially flood. Also, given that there's a critical facility and that there's near-term investment going into critical facility armoring and to dry egress for the facility, you could see that maybe a first choice might be to build or raise the road along the edge here, since it's kind of the most direct connection. But if there were a recognition of the potential for investment that also went into this as a resilience corridor, the investment for the critical facility could serve multiple benefits, providing investment in a road that could provide feeder access to multiple homes throughout this area. So the benefit in this case in terms of this resilience corridor and multifunctional value is that not only could a raised road strategy serve this critical facility, it could provide egress, and the homeowners could individually make choices about raising, which a raised road could help support the value of that investment. At the same time, the resilience corridor strategy and raising from behind and providing these feeder roads allows flooding to occur, and it's a negotiation strategy with DEEP around redevelopment of the floodplain to maintain floodplain hydrology while maintaining housing. You can also see that in certain cases, for example, in this zone, some of the lots don't have housing anymore. This is an idea of managed retreat in areas that are at high risk that really don't have easy solutions. And the third graphic is looking at a floodgate and development planning strategy. There are multiple instances across Connecticut's coast where you have inland marsh systems or impounded marshes with roads and housing and culverts. And this kind of circumstance is one that's fairly complex and requires technical analysis to understand the risks. One has to investigate and evaluate wave height and the elevation of the roads and the impact as a constraint or constriction for flooding, because in many cases what we found is that there's that the analysis that's being done is overestimating the flood risk. And when you're dealing with homes that are adjacent to these impounded marshes and concerned in the long term about potential flooding for property and investment strategies in these areas, taking a more in-depth technical analysis where you look at wave height and understand the elevation of the roads, and you evaluate, for example, the capacity of the wetland system to as a volume to catch water that does overtop the roads, it's likely that we'll find many instances where the raised road and the wetland complex serve as a functional value in terms of flood management for the adjacent homes. And this kind of relationship between home value property and house raising and dry egress and wetland function are essential and occur in multiple municipalities across the coast. And CIRCA is very interested in raising the bar in terms of the technical analysis that goes into the evaluation of these kinds of risks. And we're working on protocols to share with municipalities to evaluate these types of risk conditions. So in conclusion, I want to emphasize that that we're working on these visualizations as a tool for understanding the trade-offs and the challenges and for understanding the technical risks, and as a means to convey the technical applications needed to evaluate those risks. We want to get feedback on these drawings. We're interested in feedback regarding the value of the visualizations, the presentation, as well as the content provided. And we want to emphasize that these are iterative. The goal with CIRCA is to work with the state agencies, to work with the COGS, work with municipalities, engineering and design firms, and the public to move Connecticut forward as far as smart decision-making and informed decision-making around resiliency planning over time. We plan to upload these to our website in September for more public input, and we hope that you have enjoyed this initial rendition of these visualizations, and we look forward to any feedback you'd like to provide. And I've provided my contact information here. You can get in touch with us this email or go to the CIRCA website to make contact. I want to thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks, Alex. We will send out that CIRCA website that's being mentioned. We have a new Sea Level Rise Focus website, so we'll send that out to all of you as participants following the webinar, along with, like I said at the beginning, we're recording. And so I wanted to make sure that you all know that we'll be following up with email following this webinar to send some of the resources that have been highlighted here today. But let's transition to a few questions that we've received. And just as a reminder to all of you that have questions, you can use the chat button or the chat bubble. If it's not open, you can click on that, type your question, and enter it. And then we can move on to the Q&A portion here. We do have one question that's already come in. I'll read it off. Will coastal communities that are also MS4 communities be given funding to comply to the MS4 mandate? Typically an unfunded mandate by a federal state government, MS4 is a great opportunity to incorporate green infrastructure. You know, we don't administer the MS4 permits. That's more of a state agency deep, and I know UConn Clear is more involved, I think, in that permitting and providing technical assistance and capacity to communities. So I'm not sure we have a direct answer to that. I will say that our Resilience Roundup does regularly, which is a monthly newsletter, electronic newsletter that CIRCA sends out, has funding availability announcements in it. And so different grant programs like the recent Long Island Sound Futures Fund program, you know, different grant programs that address stormwater, green infrastructure, they come up periodically, and we as CIRCA, you know, take our role to kind of be a communicator and get information about different grant programs like that out. So please, if you're not already signed up to receive our Resilience Roundup, then you can do that through our website.
I would also say, just in general, that one of the key potentials with resilience is to look more broadly at exposed areas. So to recognize the value, whether it's roads that serve as barriers, or whether it's municipal stormwater, and looking at other functions it can serve once you're developing and updating anyway, to try and make yourself more resilient. So my hope is that whatever type of infrastructure we're talking about revisiting, that when you start looking from a resilience standpoint, there's always an incentive to look more broadly. And that can potentially activate sources of funding that, when you start thinking this way, that you might not have thought about if you were trying to address the narrower problem of storm discharge versus trying to reconfigure an area. So that's a very general answer, but it is, I think, the way that we've seen evidence that this is the direction for thinking in lots of states. They're starting to look at areas more broadly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any other questions that came in through the chat box, but you know, I actually have one that relates to a message that both of you had throughout your presentations, and that Connecticut doesn't only need to think about these larger hurricane events. We need to be thinking about this more frequent flooding, storm surge, high precipitation events. So Alex, on the screen, you still have your 3 schematics. Do you feel like the visualization tools you guys have talked about today represent this more frequent nuisance flooding as accurately and you know, it's helpful to the audience on the line as these hurricane events? I mean, these visualization tools can be applied to both.
Yeah, I think you can look at hurricane events in both instances and look at the impacts that they have. I think the in general, I mean, we've debated this at CIRCA in multiple occasions in terms of how should we be planning for hurricane events, should we be planning for chronic storms, and ultimately there are certain conditions or components of land use that where planning for hurricanes is necessary, particularly critical facilities in areas that are fundamentally part of the infrastructure of the municipality or region. For homeowners, it's in neighborhoods, it's a little more difficult to plan for hurricane events, and and I think in many ways the Connecticut residents have grown accustomed to, or at least recognize that hurricanes are part of living in this area. In the near term, I think the strategy really is to focus on chronic storm events and on the nuisance flooding, with mid to long-term planning that's smart planning that will over time address hurricane risk. And I think that near-term adaptation strategy with long-term planning for I think is an approach that will be relevant and valuable for Connecticut. Part of the value with living in Connecticut is that the coastal conditions across Connecticut have both high ground and patches of risk. So we don't have many ubiquitous areas that are flooded. So it allows us to tinker over time with those areas that are at risk and to make smart planning decisions, hopefully as from the state down to municipality to adapt in the long term.
So we do have a couple new questions that have come in. I'll read one that's kind of related to your presentation, Alex, since you were just speaking. Have you developed actual zones of shared risk, or is it just a concept at this point?
Great question. So we have developed zones of shared risk for targeted municipalities. We've been doing it, as a sort of on a case-by-case basis, depending on, for example, the Madison presentation that I shared with you. That was a process where, we rolled up our sleeves at CIRCA and we did assessments of the risks, of the areas at risk that the town had presented to us, and we looked more broadly, and then we identified zones of shared risk that we shared with the town. That identification it's also an iterative process. It's important to recognize that these are ideas or risks that we're highlighting, but that they need to be vetted and evaluated by the municipal engineer and town planners, as well as the public. We're working now. We're starting to build on the vulnerability assessment that CIRCA is pulling together as a tool to work through municipality to municipality and identify zones of shared risk across municipalities. So that is a next step that we're working on.
I would also encourage you that part of the reason that we have the visualization scenarios is that it's really to encourage municipalities or state agencies to start thinking this way and be able to identify them themselves. It's a different form of zoning, a different way to think about it. One of the maps that Alex had up earlier was a LiDAR map that he referenced. It kind of looks like a relief marshmallow view of an area. And I know that when we presented that to members of the public, they readily understood that while they think in different neighborhoods, once you look at the elevations, they can recognize how the floodwaters will not necessarily care that they're in different neighborhoods, they're actually in the same place. And that can guide municipal decision making, Board of Finance decisions. It can really change a lot that's going on. One other thing I did want to mention, a highly knowledgeable questioner asked about whether these would be available, how people could get them. I think Alex mentioned that these diagrams are going to continue to be refined. So if you have any suggestions, please email Alex, and we'll be putting them on in September. And we'd encourage any of you that are engaged in this, use the comments as a way to really help implement some of the legal and policy changes that we started with.
And we'll be sure when they do go online in September that all of you receive a notice and a link to where those are. We do have a couple other questions that have come in. How do you reconcile potentially contradictory flood management strategies, such as managed retreat and construction of new tide gates and berms? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a great question.
That is a great question.
that's one of the reasons why I think CIRCA is, I presented a third visualization of an example like that, where we have wave action and an inland marsh. Those are really on a case-by-case basis. So our goal would be to, based on the technical protocols that we're developing, that engineering firms hired by municipalities or municipal engineers working on these specific locations will do field observations to get specific data on wave height dynamics and elevations and constrictions, and understand better on a case-by-case basis what the flood risks are and what the trade-offs are associated with the ecological function of the inland marsh, because obviously these constrictions create hydrologic changes that can impact marsh function. And over time, our goal is to try to develop strategies and protocols for ideally win-win situations where you manage flood risk and you promote hydrologic function. But we want to tee up or identify or tease out these issues that were described by the questioner in terms of what are the trade-offs associated with these kinds of conditions. There are existing tide gates that have an impact now, and there are proposed or interest in constructing these as a floodplain management tool that obviously have considerable regulatory constraints. So we're interested in that area, and we need to take steps to understand better on a customized level.
I think also one of the other real opportunities is that once you start looking at the problem in this way in slightly broader scale, you then come to different solutions, right? If you have a flooded area, it'd be very easy to raise the road and build a wall, right? That's always an easy and expensive answer. I think when you start looking a little more broadly, you start to ask yourself different questions, like, okay, should the affected area, in part of an area, start to make their own decisions, manage themselves as a community, like an historic district? Are there legal structures that they would want to use? It's something I'm very interested in, and some of my students have been very interested in. A subsequent questioner has asked if do the varying housing values figure into any of this analysis. At this stage, no, we're trying to identify the problem. Over time, the answer may be yes, right? Depending on how you're looking at different parts of the community, and the coastal communities can be varied. So I do think that there's a really good opportunity when you start looking at it this way to look at atypical decisions. One thing that we talked about, or Alex talked about a bit, was also preserving the methods of egress, right? The corridors that connect these areas too, and what can be the development around them. And that involves decisions beyond just flood management, but also economic development and to how we do things. That's part of what will be our next research project.
So we have time for one or two more questions if those of you on the line want to chat and type in another question you might have. I do want to point out that regarding the last question that Joe answered in terms of housing values, we do have a current CIRCA research project that's being funded to a couple UConn faculty, Stephen Swallow and Charles Tao. That report isn't yet available, but we expect it to be available this fall. And it takes a look at some of these topics of raising elevation and kind of that first line of houses and the second line, and how that property value and tax implications to communities is potentially relevant to this issue with sea level rise and flooding. And so we do want to point out that that project is currently underway, and we expect to have some results about that in the fall. So be on the lookout for that through our Resilience Roundup too.
I also do want to point out that the value of your community in having a real resilience plan, because many of us get calls just from random people saying, hey, I'm looking to buy on X area near the water, what can CIRCA tell us? And part of that's great to contact, Alex, if you can get a hold of someone with a lot of experience, but a lot of those questions really go to communities and how they're addressing it. And I think that's really a very big issue for this. Mm-hmm. There's a question. There's a question that is really important that someone just posted on how does income equality, or I would actually say inequality, weave into this area. In terms of the data, I would probably point to, I don't know if Stephen's looking at actual income equality as versus the proxy for a home value. But I do think that there is a big problem, and this started way back in the Shoreline Preservation Task Force when James Albus, who was the representative from East Haven, formed it and did this sort of very atypical governmental structure, bringing all the coastal legislators together with jobs and hearings, and really started to identify this problem after the storms. It became very clear that some of the areas that have smaller, lower value homes are really much more exposed. They can't recover the same way. And that has to pay attention, and this is really a problem that exceeds any individual municipality in terms of trying to preserve those communities. Otherwise, they don't spring back, and they aren't automatically redeveloped. What we see is just a very slow progress. So, you know, really that's a home value as a proxy for income equality, but I think that's I think probably to the spirit of your question.
Mm-hmm.
And Alex, you've worked in both Bridgeport, East Haven, West Haven. I mean, I'm curious if you have any insights on the projects, the resilience projects that you've been involved in some of those communities.
Yeah, I do think this question of income equality is a major consideration when dealing with flood risk. I did work also with Rob Mendelson at Yale on a economic analysis that was funded through CIRCA prior to my joining CIRCA. And we were looking, and it was very clear with our analysis that the property value had a big impact on, and the income capacity had a big impact on the value of constructing or armoring, and also on the value of raising homes. And you know, there is the example in West Haven of the managed retreats there, the buyout program that occurred, and very few homes in West Haven have been raised over time, as in contrast to places like Fairfield, where you do have a fair amount of house raising. When homes are raised, it puts pressure on the municipality to then provide services to those homeowners. So there's an interesting kind of hidden pressure, or you know, a way in which the municipality ends up paying or putting money into support raising homes. So I think all of those kinds of considerations, you know, including the risk, the potentially higher risk that the lower income homes may have based on their geographic location, et cetera. All those types of risks are things that we need to take into consideration and look at in a customized way, and to think about with the state, to think about with the Department of Housing, and to think about it from a public health lens, and to really investigate and consider ways in which we can address that inequality issue.
There's also another interesting policy problem that happens on the other end of that curve. One thing that many of us expected was that federal flood insurance would drive behavior, right? You have to elevate your home. Why? You're getting a mortgage. The mortgage requires flood insurance. That's going to then drive you to elevate your home. For several people that have looked at Connecticut real estate and are buying, we're hearing this from planners, they are of certain means that they've decided that they are not going to actually take the federal flood insurance. They're not going to elevate their homes. They're able to assume that risk financially. What that means, though, is, and it's a great personal decision, but a home that gets destroyed has a big community impact, even if it can be rebuilt, has a safety impact, has a community impact. And I think what it really means for us, and this is a new phenomenon to get our arms around, is to say flood insurance doesn't drive behavior, you know, and is driving maybe even less so, as Connecticut real estate hasn't accelerated the way of some of the other coastal states. So this is a very thorny and complicated issue. We're going to see it playing out over years.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Joe and Alex. We are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to close with a warm note of thanks to both of you and to everyone for joining today. And we'll follow up with an email that has some of the resources and links that were mentioned in the hour here. But we appreciate all of you joining, and we hope that you'll continue to tune in the months ahead. We do plan to have this as a monthly webinar series, but we are taking the month of August off, recognizing that vacation schedules are tough for people to be joining during that month. So we'll be reconvening these webinars in September, and we hope to see all of you then. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.